Hello, and welcome to another GAD 172 tutorial, this time focusing on BSPs. So this is going to be a Unreal Engine tutorial for creating really basic grayboxing for your levels using the BSP tools, the geometry tools within Unreal Engine. This tutorial can apply to any level design class, so if you're watching this for a different class, it's totally fine, the same principles will apply. So the first thing we're going to do is, after we've booted up Unreal Engine, we're just going to go File, and we're going to make a new level. I'm going to choose the default, because it gives a nice kind of skybox, and it has everything kind of already built in for us, which is really, really handy. So I've got kind of like a basic shape sitting on the floor. I'm just going to remove that, because we're going to add our own floor ourselves. So the majority of what we'll be doing is using the geometry tools over here. We have a box, a cone, a cylinder, curved stair, linear stair, spiral stair, and sphere. Now with each of these, if we click and drag this into the level, you'll see that it builds a box out of the lines that you can see here. As you move the sort of outline of the box, it then fills in the space with geometry. So we can set the location of this to be 0, 0, 0, so that it sits in the center. And we don't want to really use the scale tool, and the reason we don't want to use the scale tool is, as you can see, it stretches the texture on the object. We don't really want that. We don't really want stretch textures. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to manipulate the shape of this using the brush settings tool here. So we can modify the X, Y, and Z values, and you'll see instead of stretching the texture, it actually just applies a sort of tiling effect instead, which is really, really useful. So we can make this as thin as we want, so we're going to make it fairly thin because it's going to be our floor, and we can make it as big as we like as well. So I'm going to make this fairly big, say 2000 by 2000 just to start with. So we can drag in different types of shapes. We can drag in another box, we can drag in a cone, a cylinder, a curved stair, linear stair, spiral stair, and a sphere. I'm going to show you kind of how each of these works. So we'll start with the box, which is the simplest shape. So the box just has some really basic settings. The kind of XYZ positions for its size, as well as whether or not it's a hollow box. If we tick this, we can actually go inside the box, and you can see it has some room inside, and you can determine the thickness using the wall thickness settings. So the bigger this is, the thicker the walls. You can kind of see that effect if you kind of clip inside a little bit here. If we turn hollow off, it removes the space in the middle. Now we also have the cone, and the cone has a few extra settings. We have things like the outer radius, which changes how wide the base is of the cone, or how small it is. We also have the Z, which is the point, so how far from the sort of flat surface to the point surface that determines the distance on that. We also have the sides, so how rounded this cone shape is, so we can make it really rounded, or we can make it more triangular. So it's sort of up to you how much you want. Just be aware though that the more sort of sides that you have, the smoother the object looks, but also the more polygons it has to render, which is very taxing if you have a lot of these. So I would try and keep the sides as small as possible. You can get away with having only a few and still getting that kind of sort of roundish effect. Same thing goes for a cylinder. It's pretty much got the same settings with the sides. The only difference is that it also has outer radius and Z. So we can kind of change that. We can also make it hollow to make it kind of like a ring shape. So that's sort of, you know, what the cylinder can do. It's pretty straightforward. You can also rotate these shapes to be any orientation you like. And when you change the settings, it still just affects the shape as normal. So let's move on to the stairs. So the stairs actually have different properties. The curved stairs have a couple of settings, such as the inner radius, which determines how sharp the inner angle is. So you can see here, very sharp to very wide. We also have the step height, so how high each step is. So as you can see, by increasing that, it changes the height of each step, or we can lower it. We can also change the step width, so how wide the stairs are. So you can make fairly wide or fairly narrow steps. We can change the angle of the curve, so if we want these stairs to kind of like loop around themselves, we can go full 360, or you can have it kind of much shorter. It's totally up to you. And you can change the number of steps. So by changing the number of steps on this particular staircase, it just increases the height to accommodate for extra steps. If you were to, for instance, rotate this around 360, then it would just increase the number of steps between sort of 0 and 360, and make sure it tries to fit all of them in, which is why it'll keep escalating higher and higher. So these little yellow arrows I'm clicking are just resetting back to the default settings. So that's if you want to just kind of reset back. Linear stairs, basically the same thing. By this time increasing the number of steps increases the size and how far the steps actually go. So that can be useful for if you've like predetermined where you kind of want like the start of your staircase, and you're trying to line it up with like a floor that you want it to sit amongst. That's kind of how you can do that. It's got the same settings for like step length. You can determine how like sort of long each step is, like that way. The step height, same setting, and step width is the same setting as well. So yeah, the the spiral staircase is a lot like the curved staircase, except you'll notice that they aren't connected to the ground. So the curved staircase, everything kind of sits flush with the ground. The spiral one, it's floating in the air. But you can change all the same settings. Number of steps per 360 will increase how many steps are required to make a full 360-degree pass. So as you can see now, in order to get that 360, I need to add more steps. You can also add things like whether or not it's sloped underneath, so whether it's a flat slope, and whether or not it's a sloped floor, so you can actually have like a kind of smooth kind of staircase. It's more like a, I guess like a twisted art piece now, like a flat slope, which is really cool. You can also change the direction to be counterclockwise instead of clockwise. So there's a lot of cool settings you can do with the different staircases, which are pretty neat. And now we have the sphere. The sphere doesn't look like a sphere at the moment because, again, just like the cylinder and the cone, we haven't given it enough sort of sides. So we could change the tessellation here, and that changes the complexity and turns it from that kind of weird sort of dodecahedron looking thing into an actual sphere. But again, this takes a lot of resources, so just be careful. Radius will just change the size of the sphere itself. Just be aware that your computer will kind of struggle a bit with bigger shapes and more complex shapes. So obviously I can shrink this down to a nice little shape, and it still looks like a sphere, even though it's only got a tessellation of 3. You can kind of get away with like pretty small shapes, but yeah, for the most part, because it's a grey box, it's a placeholder, it doesn't need to be super complex. So those are the basic shapes for BSP. I'm going to show you a couple of tricks now that you can do using a system, because at the moment all we've done is we've created brushes that create geometry. I'm now going to show you brushes that will actually remove geometry. So let me just make some space here by deleting some of these. Okay, let's take our box. And let's say, for instance, I wanted to make a couch. Let's make a couch object quickly. So the way I would do that is I would block it out as if I was going to, like, as if the couch was going to be an entire box. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another box object. And this time I'm going to change the brush type from additive to subtractive. What that's going to do is it's going to create an invisible sort of cutting tool. And if I move that now into this box, you'll see that it actually cuts away that portion of the geometry. Now this is really useful because you can use this to create some more complex shapes without spending too much effort. So let's say I want my couch to kind of be a little bit like this. So now I've created a very, very simple looking couch. If I was building like a sort of like a house or a hotel level, I might use this to kind of just block out where a couch might go in my level. Something to note is with the geometry tools, if you have a subtraction tool and then you add an addition tool, you'll notice that the addition tool seeps through even though you've got a subtraction tool here. And that's because of the placement of where the objects are in the environment and the order that they were placed in. So something that you'll know is notice is that in the icon here, this box has the minus symbol, and that's because that's a subtract tool. The most recently placed object is this geometry here, so this kind of overwrites that subtract tool. But if we were to, say, cut the subtract tool using Control X, and then we were to paste it back in using Control V, then the subtract tool would be the most recently placed object, and it would take priority. So as you can see here, it's now cutting into that other geometry that we placed, which means that now this geometry is being affected by it as well. So that's something to keep in mind when you're building with BSPs, is that if you want stuff to stay cut out, make sure that it's the most recently placed thing. And you can always just like take it out and replace it. Likewise, if we didn't want this geometry to be affected, we would just cut it and then paste it back in, and we would get our geometry back. So that's something that's important to kind of keep track of when you're building your levels, is the order that you sort of place your BSPs in. Okay, so let's go into a bit more of a logical example on building a level. One thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to import a texture for our level, and this is going to be, this could be anything. For my example, it's going to be, you know, if I'd done a floor plan and I'd sketched it onto a piece of paper, this is what it might look like, and I've just imported it into Unreal. So this is the floor plan here. It's got some buildings laid out, it's got some like the environment laid out. So what I can do is I can take this image here and I can apply it to this surface, and the way you do that is you just click on the surface, make sure it's highlighted, and then just click and drag your texture onto that surface. It'll create a material for you. Just give it a few seconds for the material to actually sort of compile. It's compiling the shaders up here, so it'll take a second. And you'll notice that at the moment the material kind of tiles out in a really, really funny way. There's like a bunch of these. The way you can fix that is you can change the scale. So over here on the right hand side, while that surface is selected, we have this scale tool for U and V. If you don't have that, just make sure you just click the surface again, and you should see these appear. So I'm going to make the scale, let's say 8. I'm going to click this lock, because what that's going to do is it's going to lock the scale for both the vertical and the horizontal axes. So we're going to hit apply. And you'll see here that it's blown my image up, but it's not quite where we want it yet. So let's try 16. 16 is close, but not quite there yet. So we might try something like 24. And you can type in numbers manually. And the idea is that you just want to try and get it as close as possible. That might be too much. Okay, that'll do. So we've got our buildings here, our floor plan kind of like laid out. So now what we can do is we can actually go through and start building this geometry. One tip I would have is to change from perspective to top view. It'll create a flat view, and by default it's in wireframe mode, so you can't see the image. But if you just click on brush wireframe at the top here and just go to unlit or lit, it will actually give you the sort of view that you're looking for. So what I'm going to do is, in perspective mode, I'm just going to throw down my first box geometry, just to make sure that it's sort of sitting flush with the ground, just so I don't have things kind of floating in the air. So let me just lower this down a little bit. Okay. So this will be my first building. So now I'm going to go back to the top view, and I'm just going to build out using this top view. So this will be how I basically do this, is I'm going to use the X and the Y to kind of manipulate the shape. And then Control W lets you duplicate an item. So I'm going to Control W. It's kind of easier if you think about this in terms of putting the pivot point in the center of the object before you scale. So when I duplicate this, I'm going to look for the center of this rectangle, put my pivot point about there, and then I will scale my box accordingly. So it just makes it a bit faster. And for stuff like buildings that are kind of conjoined, you can just kind of stick them next to each other. We can tweak some of the looks of them later so that they look more sort of flush. We can go through and edit those details. But this is kind of the way that I would, just initially block out an environment just so I can kind of get an idea of the scale, make sure that my character can actually move around this environment freely, and that they don't feel like the space is too big or too small, and you can kind of get stuff happening a lot faster with playtesting, which is super important when it comes to level design. Playtesting is one of the number one things that you kind of want to focus on, sort of as soon as possible, so that you can refine and reiterate parts of your level. So I would just keep doing this, blocking out the entire level, and then eventually I would get to a point where I'd be done. I'm just going to kind of stop it about here, just to kind of show you that I've kind of laid out my level. One thing that you kind of need to keep note of is that if you are doing it this way, your level is going to look very kind of two-dimensional. You're not going to have a lot of verticality to your level. So it's good to kind of plan ahead for things like adding staircases and ladders and different heights for these kind of things. And in order to control the height, I'm actually going to show you another tool that you can use. So if I go to the modes section, I'm going to switch to brush editing mode. Now the brush editing mode lets you select a face or a pivot point, a vertex or an edge, and it lets you actually control those specific things. So you can see here I've grabbed an edge. If I was to manipulate this edge, it would change the shape, as you can see here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab the face and I'm going to pull the face up, and you'll notice that that pulls the object up, and it acts like I'm controlling it using the properties section, but I'm actually not. Something to keep in mind is that doing this, the pivot point won't move. So now if I go back to select mode, and I reselect this object, the pivot point is still in the center of what the shape used to be, and this part that I've extended hasn't changed where that pivot point location is. So that's something to keep in mind, is you don't want to try and manipulate this too much away from the pivot point, because what you'll end up doing is the pivot point will end up being like over here while your shape is over here. So just be careful of that when you're manipulating using the brush editing tool. The brush editing tool gives you options for different things, like the ability to extrude. If you've done 3D modeling, you kind of know what this already this does already. But if you don't, the extrude tool, we're just gonna hit don't show again. The extrude tool lets you pull out another section of geometry, and it creates this kind of sort of cut in the geometry here. And then what you can do from there is you can do something like this, where you extrude out from here, and suddenly you've got a shape that kind of looks like this sort of L shape. Now, you could have done the same thing with a big box and then using a subtract tool to cut this out, but this can be useful in certain scenarios, especially when it comes to different shapes like cylinders and cones and stuff like that. So have a bit of a play around with what you think will work for you. You can do multiple faces at once by holding control and highlighting multiple faces, and then you can extrude both of these out, for instance. And then when you go back to select mode, just remember, the pivot point won't have changed. So the pivot point is still going to stay in the same location, but your shape is now this slightly different shape. So if you're building like a helipad or something, that could be useful. But just, yeah, keep in mind that the shape itself won't change the pivot point's location, no matter how much you add on to it. So that's kind of the basic overview of BSPs and how they work. Again, you could do different kind of crazy shapes with using the addition and subtraction tool. So I could subtract from this square to get a kind of like a rounded shape here. By changing the radius, I can affect how much of that is being cut out. So now I have this cool looking sort of shape up here, which looks nice. Now, once you've blocked out your entire level, and only when you've blocked out your entire level, you'll notice that BSPs are starting to slow your computer down because it's got to calculate all of this information. What you can do is you can actually convert your BSPs into static meshes, which will reduce the load a lot. The way you do that is that you highlight the object that you want to convert to a static mesh, and you go down to the bottom, and you can type in the details section as well. There's a option for converting to static mesh. I think we have to have the subtraction tool selected as well that's affecting this. Oh, maybe it doesn't come up unless you show it. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So, what we can do is we can basically convert this to a static mesh so that the object will sort of stay like this permanently. Now, this is an irreversible process. Do not do this unless you're absolutely sure that this is the final geometry that you want for your level, because you can't edit this. So once you've kind of got your block out and you just want to like clean up so that your computer doesn't, drop as many frames when you're working in your level and you're replacing all these gray boxes with assets, you can go to the brush settings, hit the little arrow drop down at the bottom, and click on Create Static Mesh. It'll ask you to save the static mesh in a location and give it a name. So if this was going to be a building with a helipad, I'd just call this helipad office or something. I'd probably have a meshes folder to put this in. For now, I'm just going to put it in my content folder. And now you can see here, because I didn't select the subtraction brush as well, it didn't save the cutout that I'd made. But this static mesh here now exists. And you can see here that this is the mesh that it made. So if I undo what I just did, it'll go back to being a BSP. Again, this is, you can only really undo with Control Z. So if you've already, like the static mesh is still here. If you've already kind of done other stuff after you've done this, you won't be able to get this back. It's kind of a one-way thing. So if I select both of these now, and then I hit create static mesh, it should create it. I'm just going to name this try helipad office 1. Okay, so now it's made the static mesh with the cutout, which is exactly what we wanted. So now we can duplicate this. If we want like a couple in our level, I'm just gonna move this over here. We could put a couple down, and it's now a static mesh, and you can see the outline, the yellow outline, is now surrounding just this object, and that's reduced the calls on the maths because it's no longer having to calculate each vertex, each edge, and draw a face in between it. Now it just has to render an object as if it was just another 3D model. So it's less taxing on your computer, especially if you go around and convert all of your BSPs to static meshes. But again, you should only be doing this once you're at the end of the grey boxing phase and you're ready to start replacing these with proper assets. Because converting them to a static mesh makes them easier to get rid of as well. So yeah, that's grey boxing in a nutshell. That's BSPs. That's Unreal Engine's BSP system. If you have any questions, feel free to drop it in the Discord. For whichever class this is, talk to your lecturer, or if I'm your lecturer, just have a chat with me, and I will help you out. Hope this helps, and thanks for watching.